Hi everyone, I'm Eva van Massenova. I'm an assistant professor in Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and I'll be presenting joint work with Professor Joanna Monti from the University of Naples L'Orientale. And our work is called gENder-IT, an annotated English-Italian parallel challenge set for cross-linguistic natural gender phenomena. So first of all, something briefly about gender in language. I'm sure most of you are aware of this given the nature of the workshop, but there are some systematic structural differences between language in the way they handle gender. This can be because of the absence or presence of gender features in terms of the number of linguistic gender classes, how gender features are marked, where they're marked, what the underlying rules are by which gender is assigned. And just to give a kind of interesting example, I believe, or I think, from a Flemish dialect. So this is a dialect from the west of Flanders in Belgium, where they have a declension for the adverbs yes and no, which is by itself already quite interesting. But the declension doesn't only exist in terms of number, you also have different forms in terms of gender. So you basically have 3 forms in the third person for yes and no, depending on the gender. Then that's on a monolingual level for that specific dialect. What do you get in cross-linguistic settings? Well, it becomes, of course, increasingly more difficult. And as I refer to it here, you get basically double trouble, especially for machine translation systems. These things are very hard to handle because some languages have implicit genders, while in the other language, it needs to be made explicit, and then that information needs to be inferred somehow. Sometimes that can be done using just a sentence, but often it can't, and you need context, or you might need meta context, and so it's a very difficult problem. Sometimes you also want to generate multiple alternatives because you simply don't know. And so here are some examples of that, among others, this tweet that went viral, translating from Hungarian, which is gender neutral, into English, and then you see all kinds of biased output appearing. In terms of related work, there has been quite some work in recent years on bias and gender in NLP and MT, and there are also some existing data sets for the mitigation and assessment of gender bias. Because of time restrictions, I'm not gonna go through them in detail, but all of them basically focus on one specific phenomenon, whether this is gender agreement with the speaker or gender of animate nouns. It's always limited to one specific person. But what would we actually need for machine translation? Well, it depends, of course, on the application and the context in which you're translating. But what would be handy would be something to detect ambiguity in certain contexts, and then a way of controlling the gender of the reference, and the ability to provide the user with multiple options. What do we lack to do that? Well, sometimes we lack some expertise, maybe in terms of the linguistic expertise that is necessary. But we definitely also lack data in order to train systems or to test them. And we need some sort of parallel data, masculine, feminine, gender neutral, but also annotated controllers would be very handy. And controllers are defined in the framework of Jenny Autering as those things that trigger the agreement. So they're usually the head noun of a noun phrase, but they can also be pronouns, for instance. Now, in that context, what is gENder-IT? gENder-IT is an annotated, adapted, and a clean version of a subset of an already existing corpus, which is the Must-She corpus by Benti Vogli. We provided word-level annotations for ambiguous pronouns and nouns, basically word-level annotations for all the controllers. So these are usually nouns or pronouns, but it can also be an adjective used as a noun. And we also provide on the target side then multiple correct translations when there is ambiguity in the source in terms of gender. In terms of data, details on data, we had 694 sentences. They were all annotated independently, and we did also correct some issues that we observed in the corpus, like spelling mistakes. And then we provided those tags. So these tags are either F, female, M, male, or A, ambiguous, when you can't know the gender based on the context. This was done for all pronouns and nouns that were referring to a person, but not for those that are already gender specific by themselves, such as that or she. Then we made some decisions in terms of proper names, for instance, and this is different from how it is handled in the original must-she corpus. We decided not to determine or to tag the gender based on a name, on a proper name, because of different naming conventions in different cultures, and because you can't really infer the gender from a name or gender preferences from a name. We made an exception when it came to public figures. So for instance, Martin Luther King appeared in the corpus, then we did tag Martin Luther King as male. Then in terms of the multiple translations were generated in cases of ambiguity. So here, for instance, with an adjective or a past participle used as an adjective in a copula construction, we needed both a masculine and a feminine version. For animate nouns, like remember that patient, where there is no further information about that patient, then we would need to generate, or we created two versions of the translation. Another decision that we made is to also include the feminine alternatives for those cases where there was an inclusive masculine form used or a generic masculine form. So for some professions, for instance, like usually high functions like president or director, you can use the male form for both men and women. But we decided to include also the more marked female forms, although recently there has been some debate and some women, for instance, prefer the male version anyway, because they say it's more prestigious. And that brings us to the last slide. So for future work, we would like to extend this corpus to other target languages. We would also like to work on the automatic identification of gender ambiguity and the generation then of multiple gender alternative translations. And of course, we'd also like to explore the possibilities in terms of gender neutral paraphrasing and gender neutral forms. But as this has not been crystallized in many languages yet, we left that out for now. And that was it. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.